Good afternoon. This is an interview with Harvey Pitt for the SEC Historical Society's Virtual Museum and Archive of the History of the U.S. Securities Markets and Financial Regulation. I'm Dan Goelzer. The date is February 7th, 2019, and we're in Washington, D.C. Just to set the stage a bit, from 1968 to 1978, Harvey Pitt served on the staff of the Securities and Exchange Commission, eventually becoming, in 1975, the youngest general counsel in the SEC's history. Harvey had a second SEC career beginning in 2001 when he was the 26th chairman of the commission. For the nearly 25 years in between, Harvey was a partner in the law firm of Fried Frank here in Washington and a leading member of the securities bar. After he left the SEC chairmanship, Harvey founded the strategic consulting firm Kalorama Partners, where he continues today. And we're sitting in Kalorama's offices in Washington, D.C. for this interview. I'll just add, as a personal aside, I had the privilege of working with Harvey when I was a young staff attorney at the SEC beginning in 1974, and I think I can say that no one's had a bigger impact on my career than Harvey. He's given me good advice on a wide range of legal and non-legal issues over the years, and I consider him very much a friend and a mentor. For those who'd like to get more of a sense of the full scope of Harvey's career, he has 2 oral histories already in the Virtual Museum that cover the span of his time at the SEC, both as general counsel and chairman. One was taken in May of 2007, and the second in May of 2008. So please take a look at those to learn more about Harvey's background. But today we want to talk about something a little different, and that's the origins, creation of the Historical Society itself and Harvey's role in that event. Harvey, as I think you're probably aware, we're creating a founders exhibit in the Virtual Museum that will look at how the SEC was created in honor of the 20th anniversary of the Society. There were 3 primary founders, yourself of course, and also David Ruder and Paul Gonson. David and Paul have already been interviewed, and so the oral histories of the 3 of you with respect to the Society will all be part of the founders gallery. Today we'd like to get your recollections of how the Society was born, what your role in that process was, what the responsibilities of the other founders were, and what some of the early challenges and issues that the Society faced were. So I guess it makes sense to start at the beginning. What can you tell us about where the idea to create the SEC Historical Society came from, how you first heard about it, and how did you become involved?
Well, before I do, Dan, I just want to say a word about you and the current leadership of the Historical Society. It was a real privilege for me to be able to work with you, and I consider you to be a good friend. I think with you at the helm right now and with Jane Cobb as the executive director, the Society is in fabulous hands and is making great strides forward. So I'm delighted to participate in this. With respect to the Historical Society, I first heard about this in a communication. I think it was a phone call from David Ruder. David and I had become good friends, particularly after his tenure as chairman, but he indicated to me that he had spoken with Arthur Levitt and that the thought at the commission was that an organization should be created for the SEC along the lines of the Supreme Court Historical Society. I think the analogy to the Supreme Court Historical Society was both apt and very much at the forefront of the planning, because while the Supreme Court certainly does its best to facilitate the efforts of the Supreme Court Historical Society, the Society is completely independent from the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court does not, and it would be improper for it to engage in fundraising or other similar activities. And decisions are made solely by the Historical Society. I'm a member of the Supreme Court Historical Society as well. And so the thought was that a group would be created dedicated to preserving the historical artifacts of the SEC's existence and activities, and promote policies, discussions, and similar efforts to enhance the ability of people who are interested in researching the historical antecedents of the SEC and various of its particular actions. Frequently, people read about an action taken by the commission, and they don't always know exactly what went on behind the scenes to sort of get to the point where a policy evolved and became a policy of the agency. So that was what I heard, and when David reached out to me, I was thrilled to join him and work with him, because I've admired David for most of my professional career, and even more so in later times.
So you were positive, you were enthusiastic when David presented the idea.
I was very positive about this notion, because there are so many documents and decisions that become very hard to get a hold of, and the notion of having a museum that would make these available to scholars and practitioners. I must say, as a practitioner, I have frequently utilized the facilities of the Historical Society website, and there are things on that website that I have only been able to find on the website, not elsewhere. So it is a fabulous resource for people looking to explore particular issues, or even make arguments on behalf of clients.
So this was pretty much the infancy of the internet. So at that point, the thought was a mission that revolved around physical documents.
Yes, I think the concept was we would gather all the data and the hard copy, and that eventually there would be a building to house it. In hindsight, that was probably a little naive, because finding a building or finding space to house all of this would have created prohibitive costs, but the concept was physical at the time.
All right, well, if we move the story forward, David gave you a call, presented the idea, you were enthusiastic about the idea. What happened next?
Well, we got together. David pulled together a group of people. One thing about David is his intuitive sense to find a broad base of people who captured various aspects of the SEC's historical existence was uncanny. And I might say that David has sort of developed an uncanny ability to begin new major organizations and see them through their infancy and get them up and running. The Historical Society was a very important one, but he also did that with the Mutual Fund Directors Forum. And the one thing I've noted about David throughout his career is he's organized, he's thoughtful, and he's very creative. And so I don't think Chairman Levitt could have picked anyone better than David to sort of get this off the ground. In any event, I think there was a group of about 19 or 20 people. I'm not, at my age, I'm not necessarily quite precise on the numbers, but David got together a good cross-section of people, both who had served at the commission or who had interacted with the commission. He went out of his way to find people who had connections with the agency in a variety of different areas, and we got together. We agreed on a statement of mission and purpose, and then set about the task of trying to create the reality of a historical society out of the germ of the idea that Chairman Levitt and Chairman Ruder had concocted.
Just before we go forward with the story, with the history, you've spoken a little about David and some of his really unique abilities and talents. I did want to ask you to talk a bit about your relationship with both of the other founders, Paul and David. I mean, obviously this wasn't the only time in your career that you've been involved with both of them.
No, Paul Gonson and I go back a very long way. Paul and I, ironically, both started in the general counsel's office on the very same day. Paul had been at the commission, but he had been in what was then known as the SEC's Division of Corporate Regulation, which mostly focused on bankruptcy proceedings and a statute over which the SEC finally was able to divest responsibility, the Public Utility Holding Company Act, or PUCA, as we would affectionately refer to it. But Paul and I started on the same date. Paul was my supervisor, and I worked directly for Paul and in the general counsel's office. We worked very closely together. I found Paul to be incredibly bright, incredibly hardworking. I think the first thing that troubled me the most about Paul was working on a brief late into the night one day. It turned out he knew all the night staff, and they all greeted him with great affection, which he deserved. But the fact that he knew all of these people so well, and they knew him, certainly didn't bode well, I thought, for my personal time, and that turned out to be correct. But working with Paul was just a sheer delight. He knew how to write briefs and so on. We both worked for David Ferber, who at the time was the commission's solicitor. And I was the junior, Paul was the middle person, David was the senior supervisor, a solicitor, and all of us reported to Phil Loomis, who at that time was the revered general counsel of the SEC. I wound up working with Paul for most of my first 10 plus years at the commission, although I had a stint out of the office. I actually had several stints out of the office during my tenure. Eventually, as you had alluded, I became the general counsel, and Paul wound up, in effect, working for me, which he did with incredible aplomb and grace. I've always admired Paul.
Did you and Paul and David have particular ways that you divided up the responsibilities at the inception of the Historical Society idea?
When we started, Paul was really going to focus on financial, and I was going to focus on getting a 501c3 organized. And I would say there my most brilliant contribution was to inveigle a young associate at my law firm, Noah Berlin, to take on the task of working with us. Noah eventually became the general counsel of this historical society,
and still is, as I think you know.
And he is phenomenal. He's also a remarkable enologist. He's very, very well versed in wine. So if you ever need wine suggestions from Noah, he's the person. But he bore the laboring oar.
See, I worked with Noah at the PCOB, and he didn't reveal to us his talent with respect to wine. I'm sorry I missed that.
At Fried Frank, he hosted a wine tasting for everyone. I was amazed because those were the beginning days of wineries moving away from corked bottles of wine to screw caps. And I remarked in introducing Noah for the presentation that he'd expanded my horizons, because the only time I drank wine out of a screw top bottle was when I was in college, and I think the brand was called Thunderbird. But Noah provided us with much better flavors and wines.
Well, at some fairly early point, then there must have been a decision made to create a board of trustees, which brought still more people into the picture. I mean, what can you tell us about that decision and what the criteria were and how you found other people to serve on the board?
One of I think David's important contributions, and I mentioned this in passing sort of earlier, was to expand the group that was making decisions. I think David believed that having a small group of people making critical decisions would not be good for the ultimate health and expansion of the society. So he broached the subject, and if my memory is right, David came up with the list. I know you were on that list as well. You should have been. And my recollection is that the list David came up with was perfect. One of the ulterior motives we had, I don't want to say this was diabolical, but was also by expanding the group of decision makers, we might also be able to develop potential sources of revenues, because this was not going to be a self-sustaining operation. We needed to find donors to raise money, and the early efforts focused on that as well. I don't recall any disagreement about the list of the original 20, I believe it was, something in that nature, but I think every group was fine. Everyone mentioned for the group was fine. There was some discussion because another group was forming around the same time, the Association of SEC Alumni, or ASECA. And ASECA was willing to fund us. I think there was some talk about having a permanent board seat assigned to ASECA, and I think we all agreed that it would be important for the two organizations to coexist. We did not think there was overlap between the functions. But I do recall all three of us, Paul, David, and I, were of the view that nobody should have an assigned seat on the Historical Society's board, that that should be a function of the membership and normal organizational democratic processes.
I imagine that at the time that the first board of trustees was selected, that may be the point where somebody else who was important in the early days came into the picture, which is Ted Levine.
Ted Levine was very important. He became a member. Ted and I had been very close friends and colleagues, both at the commission and then in private practice. After I left the Historical Society, at some point Ted became either the treasurer secretary and then ultimately the president. But I attribute a lot of the success that the Historical Society had in cultivating sponsorship to Ted's tenure. Ted was very organized. He knew everyone, both in private practice, in the government, and in all the affiliated entities that deal with the SEC on a daily basis. And under Ted, a lot of really great strides were made in raising capital, particularly because I remember when I left to actually become chairman of the commission, we managed to leave the association with a bit of a financial hole that had to be plugged based on our first major issues conference. So Ted was among those who was incredibly helpful. One other person who was extremely helpful was Alan Levinson. Alan was one of the original group of 20 trustees, and I remember that David, Alan, and I did the interviewing for the first executive director, who turned out to be Carla Rosati. And I remember that Alan was very, very helpful in assisting us through that process and making sure that we got the society off to a very good start.
Well, that does touch a little on something else I wanted to ask about, which was sort of how did the work get done in the early days? What was the base of operations, and then how did that lead to a decision to hire an executive director?
Well, the first thing we needed was a place for the Historical Society, and my law firm very helpfully was willing to make space available. I made staff available to work on the legal issues we had. And so for a period of time, the Historical Society's address was the address of the Fried Frank law firm at that particular point in time. David was the overall guru, sort of orchestrating all of our efforts. But the notion was to have an audit committee and have a board that would take on responsibility. Noah was doing the legal work, which led to him becoming general counsel of the society. And physical space was done, and then we had to deal with the day-to-day issues, and it became very clear that we needed somebody who had expertise in running a museum before, and Carla, we had a number of good candidates. Carla turned out to be the person we chose.
So the society progressed to the point where it had a board of trustees, an executive director, a kind of home at Fried Frank, and some support from Fried Frank. And I guess then at about that point in time, you were nominated and appointed to the SEC chairmanship, as mentioned earlier, and had to leave the society as a
I did.
As a result. I mean, you commented a little on this already, but sort of where did things stand at that point?
Yeah, at that point, the Historical Society was still in its nascent phase, but it had facilities, it had legal work ongoing, it had, I believe, received temporary 501c3 status. Eventually that became permanent, but we had Noah work under the supervision of one of our tax partners at Fried Frank, Alan Caden, who was very, very helpful in assisting us to move on down the path there. And I had become nominated to be chairman of the SEC, and so actually I was nominated to be a commissioner. The president appoints the chairman, unlike the CFTC. The position of chairman is not approved by the Senate. It's just being a commissioner, although the president indicates his intention to make that person chairman. And so I resigned from the Historical Society because it would not have been appropriate for me to keep working on that while I was pending approval. I was approved in August of 2001, but in the interim, I think Paul Gonson became the president. And I think the society was building up its membership slowly but steadily, and I think was doing well in terms of its early stages.
What was the relationship like with the SEC? I mean, you mentioned that the Supreme Court really has kinds of a, I guess you'd say, a hands-off relationship, supportive, but hands-off with respect to its historical society. What was the relationship like between the society and the SEC? And did it change when you went to the SEC?
I think the relationship was good. I think to some extent Chairman Levitt and the staff at the SEC at the time saw a couple of issues. One was there were all these documents lying around the SEC, and the SEC has always been pressed for space. Indeed, in the old days, when you walked through 500 North Capitol Street, before 455th Street and so on, you would just see boxes and boxes overflowing with papers in all the hallways. It was always a little off-putting to see that because you wondered how anybody could keep track of what was in these boxes, et cetera, which seemed completely haphazard and so on. But the SEC had space issues, and so one issue was to find a repository, otherwise a lot of these documents were going to be destroyed. I think another was to have someone record the activities, the triumphs, and maybe even the foibles at the commission. I think there was some thought on Chairman Levitt's part that perhaps the Historical Society could help advocate for the SEC. And David, Paul, and I very quickly agreed that that would not be an appropriate function. Indeed, if we were going to advocate for the SEC, we would not have been able to become a 501c3 organization. And we very much wanted to be a not-for-profit, tax-exempt organization. So that idea was rejected. But I think there was very good cooperation, notwithstanding that. I mean, I think members of the SEC staff, people like Jack Katz and others, who was the secretary of the commission for many, many years, were helpful. They provided information. They provided guidance at times when it was needed. When I became chairman, I was, of course, very gung-ho about the Historical Society and deemed it to be very important that the commission, without compromising the society's independence, show its support and assistance. And one of the first things we had talked about was having a major issues conference. Over the years, the Commission has had a number of major issues conferences. When Rod Hills was chairman in '75, the Commission had a major issues conference. I was rapporteur for that conference, and it was I thought very much so, that having a major issues conference, particularly at the beginning of what would be my tenure as chairman, would be ideal. And then I think Paul and others agreed with it. I went out of my way to support this notion. I would say the Major Issues Conference was a huge artistic success. It was, however, not by any means a commercial success, and left a gargantuan economic hole of about $100,000. There had been interceding between the time of the Major Issues Conference and at the time my appointment as chairman, and then the holding of the conference, 9/11 hit. And I have no doubt that 9/11 was a major contributor to the lack of a paid attendance. We got everyone at the SEC to be able to attend for free, I believe.
Well, I'll just stop you there. I mean, whatever thought you were giving to the Major Issues Conference, that must have been one of the most hectic and challenging times in your professional life, because of course, the markets closed in the wake of 9/11, and then it fell to you, it fell to the SEC to come up, sort of preside over a plan with the exchanges about reopening them.
It was, I would have to say, it was the most intense period of my professional life. All of my professional life and in private practice, I had done crisis management, where I advised clients who were in a crisis about how to deal with it, et cetera, or how to prepare for a crisis. Here I was, chairman of the SEC, and all of a sudden, we were confronted with a huge crisis. I did an oral history on 9/11, so I won't repeat all that, but I will say night and day I was consumed with that. I went up to New York immediately the next morning, and that in itself was a major task, because we held a meeting at the New York Stock Exchange, and getting there was no easy task, and mobilized both the industry and other agencies of government, Treasury in particular. So I was away pretty much that whole week, and just intensely dealing with how to make the markets capable of reopening. My biggest fear was that we'd only get one crack. That is, we could open the markets up, but if for some reason they teetered and had to close again, we would irreparably damage confidence. And so that really meant doing this in a very careful step-by-step approach. But that certainly took attention away from things like a major issues
Oh
conference.
yeah, it's somewhere in the midst, or at least shortly after you're dealing with this national crisis. I take it you got a phone call from David Ruder informing you that registrations were very low for the conference and that the board's thought was to cancel the conference.
Yes, I think David was quite politic about it, but he was suggesting that we either, that we cancel the program or perhaps reschedule it for a much later time. I was very much afraid that if we did that, the Historical Society itself would wind up with egg all over its face and potentially never be able to develop the way we had all envisioned. We had gotten major figures to prepare papers. Senator Paul Sarbanes was giving one of the keynote addresses, and I was enormously fearful that canceling or postponing it would undermine the credibility of the Historical Society, as well as all of the efforts that had gone into putting this forward. I was also motivated to some extent by the fact that one of our approaches philosophically to the 9/11 crisis was to show the terrorists in the world that the U.S. was resilient, that we would not be cowed or stopped by this tragic event. Indeed, although I made the decision to wait until the following week to have the markets reopen, a move that was criticized in part, I was being importuned from all sides, including even the White House, to get the markets back up and running immediately to show the terrorists that they had failed. So a bit of that mindset might have been with me. In any event, I expressed my view to David, and he wound up agreeing not to defer. I can't say for certain that he agreed with me that it shouldn't be deferred, but he agreed not to defer, which is part of the reason why I credit David, because among all of his other skills, he's a consummate statesman. But we went forward with it, and as I say, the conference was a huge artistic success. Papers were written that really advanced thought on a lot of issues, but unfortunately left the Historical Society in a huge hole. Northwestern University really stepped up. Even though all of the losses were supposed to fall on the Historical Society, Northwestern picked up half and deferred the remaining half to give the Historical Society time to try and raise the outstanding $50,000 that was there. I don't know whether it was the right or the wrong decision. It was a tough decision, but the the Historical Society, notwithstanding that initial hole, really surmounted the challenge and survived, for which I'm very, very grateful.
Well, it certainly seems in hindsight that we have to agree that it was the right decision. I take your point about an artistic success, and the financial hole was eventually filled and the society moved ahead. Let me ask you about one last event that occurred shortly after the Major Issues Conference, and that was the opening of the virtual museum, and in effect the decision to switch from what, as you said, everybody assumed at the beginning would be a physical museum or physical repository of documents to an internet-based museum. I know obviously you were at the SEC then, had your hands full with many other things, but do you have any background on that decision?
Yes, I think when the reality of the difficulties associated with trying to create a physical museum became real, and when they were compounded by the hole that was created by the Major Issues Conference, people started realizing that if the society was to really succeed, it could not really afford to try and pursue a physical museum. I think we were getting there in any event, but the notion of a virtual museum was creative. It was very different because, as you pointed out earlier, we were still in an early stage of the internet and so on, but it had become more accessible, and the notion that the Historical Society, which certainly when I became chairman was still being housed at Fried Frank, and so apart from building a museum, the Society didn't have its own offices. It was paying no rent and so on. So I think it became very, very clear that something had to be done. I don't know who in particular came up with the idea, but I would say it was brilliant. In one fell swoop, it solved a lot of issues, but more importantly, it made what are now the vast resources of the Historical Society accessible to everyone. And that, after all, is what one of the underlying missions of the Society was, even though none of us had seen it at the very beginning. It took a while, but the notion of having this universal accessibility, in my view, was brilliant. It made the Society even more vital than I think it would have been had it developed a physical structure. Physical museums are wonderful. I visit museums all the time. But it's an occasion when I go to a museum. When I sit in my office and I can pull up documents that I can't find anywhere else, I know that the Historical Society is serving its most important mission, and that to me was a great idea. I don't know whose idea it was. It certainly wasn't mine. I wish it had been, but I think it was a brilliant idea.
Well, that's really a sort of a terrific summary of where the society has gone. I guess I just ask you at the end, is there anything else you'd like people to know or remember or take away from the early days of the society and the creation of the society?
I think that the SEC is an amazing institution. I think David Ruder has said anybody who works there, certainly anybody who is privileged to be chairman, comes away from the agency loving it. I love the agency from the outset of my professional career because that's where I started my professional career. I think the SEC is a fabulous institution. It's got a crucial mandate. It has very dedicated, bright, creative, and hardworking men and women. And I believe the Historical Society is an important facet of the SEC's existence. So what I would say is anybody who watches this video should take away, I hope, one factor, that this is a great organization doing wonderful things, and it can use every bit of support anybody can lend to it. And I hope that people will feel motivated to support it. As I said at the outset, and I'll conclude now, I think the society is in absolutely fabulous hands. You and Jane, the board, I think are all doing great jobs, and I'm very proud to have been a part of this organization's beginning, and I'm proud to be a supporter of it now.
Well, thank you for that, Harvey. This has been a fascinating hour of discussion. Thank you for your role in creating the society, and thank you for taking the time to discuss that history with us.
Thank you.